Last night I was out at the bar that I go to sometimes, or as I refer to it, the Tavern of Wayward Souls, and I was speaking to an acquaintance of mine about Dungeons and Dragons. He mentioned to me, DM is hard. It's difficult being a dungeon master. You have to understand the rules, and you have to tell an interesting story, and you have to keep the players engaged, and you have to coordinate schedules, and there's a lot of different skills and responsibilities and techniques, and you're juggling them all at the same time, and it's really challenging. Okay, so what he said is true, yes. However, I personally try not to focus on that. In fact, I don't recommend anybody focus on difficulty when you're learning anything at all in life. I try to just focus on what I enjoy, get into the flow, enjoy the interactions with people, and just kind of organically and semi-improvisationally enjoy the experience. However, I have made a great number of mistakes as a DM over the years before I kind of reach the point that I'm at now. So I figured it'd be worthwhile to talk about some of those, and it could be helpful for you all. You could avoid some of these, or at least this could be meaningful to you in some way. I've got a lot of notes about different mistakes I've made over the years. I don't know if I'll be able to get to them all in just one video, but I'm just going to go with it and we'll see where this takes us. So, a few months back in my home campaign, the characters were exploring a region called the Shadow Wastes. Now, this was particularly important to one of the characters, Anji. Anji is a multi-class character, but more than anything, he is a monk of the Path of Shadows. He's got some rogue, he's got some ranger, but he's more monk than anything else. And he's had this character arc of dark and light and walking the shadow, but not in full darkness, and trying to understand who he is. And they went into a dungeon called the Shadow Temple. Shadow Temple turned out to be a really interesting and probably one of the best dungeons of the campaign, but there was a big mistake that I made in this dungeon. So the player characters had explored the dungeon. There were wraiths, there were a Shadarkai cult of the Raven Queen that they encountered. They couldn't rest anywhere because there were wraiths and other shadowy threats lurking around the corner. However, they were able to find a sanctuary, this great hall of bells, and they transcribed and deciphered the runes etched on the walls that spoke of a certain pattern in which the bells had to be struck, and they would echo this ominous bell melody that would reverberate with divine magic that was initially imbued in this temple by the ancient creators, and the reverberations held the wraiths at bay for a long rest, right? So they moved on from the Hall of Bells and went deeper into the bowels of the Shadow Temple, where they eventually went into the Cave of Terrors. And down in that dismal place, each of the characters saw a shadow leviathan, a night crawler-like aspect, heading straight for it with its maw agape as though to swallow the character whole. Now at this point, I actually gave each player character a slip of paper, and I said, what does your character do in this circumstance? Tell me what you do as this massive shadow leviathan is flying, crawling, writhing straight for you to swallow you whole. What do you do? Now, before this moment had occurred, there had been some other role-playing sections and some other, we'll call it metaphysical sections, where they were delving a bit into religious/philosophical moments about the nature of knowing yourself and coming to terms with your own shadow, your own dark side. And by distributing these pieces of paper, I made it to where this was a personal experience. Indeed, each character was seeing this apparition in their own terms. And this way they weren't communicating with themselves, but they were truly confronting something personal. Each of the player characters wrote down something to the effect of, I cast such and such spell, I ready my weapon. They all went into this, we'll say, combat mode, except for dear Anji. He had paid attention to the philosophical threads that had been woven throughout the Shadow Temple, and he said, I let go and I allow the Leviathan to devour me. In being devoured and being destroyed, I'm going to be reborn. I'm going to not fight against my own inner shadow, but rather I am going to stare deep into its gullet. I'm going to confront the shadow and I am going to trust that I'm going to make it through the other side having gained from it. And this was the correct answer. So while the other characters battled their own inner shadows and fought against their own darker natures and suffered a bit because of that, I believe they took some psychic damage and a level of exhaustion, Anji himself reached a moment of epiphany. Now, what I did in this moment was I gave him a level up. I said, you have attained the next higher state of being. You have broken through a prior personal barrier in your life, and you have made it to the next step on your path of progress. You have attained the next level. This was a great thing in some ways. It was very memorable. It was very powerful. And to this day, the group still talks about this dungeon very fondly. It was memorable for them, and they feel like they really went through an experience. But it was too much. Giving an entire level up was just too much. And it was also a weird way to give that benefit. Because imagine that you have only this much experience to go until you reach your next level. Well, basically you're just getting this much of a benefit, whereas another character who would have had this much experience to go, an entire level's worth of experience, they would have received this much benefit. So it was sort of an arbitrary value to it. And also, it felt odd that he got so much reward so quickly. What would I have done differently? What would I have done better in this situation? Well, I use actually a milestone system instead of an experience point system. It's a lot like experience points. You gain milestones for overcoming and surviving challenges or thinking through meaningful situations that have consequences and something's at stake, right? So 10 milestones get you a level. Half milestone would be an easy encounter. 1 milestone would be a moderate encounter. 2 would be a hard encounter. 3 would be a very hard. 4 could be like a deadly thing that you shouldn't even survive, but somehow you did. So what I should have done is just given him milestones equivalent to that, like a very hard encounter, as opposed to simply noting out in my adventure document, whoever succeeds with this challenge gets a full level up. So yeah, it was a little bit, I guess we'd say, too overpowered of a reward. It did create a bit of discrepancy in the levels of the party. I could have done it better. Luckily, in the end, the players all went with it. They enjoyed it, and it wasn't all a loss. And just to let you know, the final chamber that they went to in this dungeon was the Womb of Darkness, and Anji wears a mask, and in this Womb of Darkness is where he was able to finally resolve the final threads of that epiphany breakthrough that he had and meet with I guess we'd call it a location of wondrous power, and his mask further unlocked its innate magical power. So this magic item that he's had since the beginning of the campaign, that's up until now had some minor magical effects, interesting and thematically relevant, but still minor. It then reached its next higher status of power. It gave him the benefits of an amulet of protection, +1 to saving throws and AC, and as well a once per day ability to cast the darkness spell and see through that magical darkness through the eyes of the mask. I'm going to reach back even further in time to many years ago to find an example of an even bigger mistake that I made. So this was in the days of 4th edition. I was in my Bane of Verland campaign, which had actually began the day that the 4th edition books were released. Began at level 1. In this campaign we played weekly, and we were going through 4th edition, basically standard 4th edition with very few house rules. It was a great campaign. The characters were part of an order of the god Bane, a lawful evil god of war, conquest, domination, and they had been slowly building up this campaign as part of this faction of the god Bane, and their two main adversaries. One would have been the local government, the proper monarchical government of the kingdom that they were occupying, and the other would be a demonic threat that had been brewing up in the woodlands to the north for some time. And the climax of this campaign was the clash between the realm of mortals, the humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, the rightly king, and the people, and all the political webs that had been in existence for quite some time. Basically, people versus the demonic force, which was led largely by Orcus. It had an Orcus theme. So there were demons, and there were undead associated with the demons, and there was this final great clash, and the player character's Order of Bane was on the side of the realm, of course. However, they were secretly trying to... they'd been secretly developing a plot to actually take over control and dominate everything. And they were hoping to use this war and this chaos and its aftermath to show we are the rightful protectors of the realm, and thus we should have the government authority. Now, the actual clash at the castle, at the main city, that combat encounter went incredibly well. It was a big encounter with a big map and lots of minis, and they had they had managed to do this costly ritual and summon down an avatar of the god Bane to fight on their side, and they were fighting against the main villain of the campaign, who was this undead demon sorcerer. And it was this massive battle with tons of minis. Took a long time to play out, but it was an interesting and memorable battle. However, this was not the entirety of the war. This was but one battle. The key battle, yes, but the greater war was still to be fought. You know, the massive hordes of demons that were clashing against the army of mortals, including the player characters. And I had developed a mass combat rules system. Now, it wasn't completely well developed to perfection, but it had gone through some basic beta testing. So it was still a little rough around the edges, and the player characters got involved in this mass combat scenario. And the result of the mass combat was that both armies fairly well wiped each other out. The human, elf, dwarf, the mortal army did win, and they had some survivors left over at the end. But the bulk of their forces were killed. They died in battle against demons and undead. Pretty severe foes. Now, of course, the demons and the undead were their side lost, right? It was a defeat for them, so they suffered even worse. Since it was such a severe result with such great casualties on both sides, there was a series of just a couple checks that the player characters would roll, and then I would roll on a random table to see what state are you in the aftermath of this battle. Where is your player character at? Is he wounded? Has he been taken captive? Was he killed? There's all sorts of terrible consequences to fighting in a massive battle. Of course, that's the reality of war, and especially if you're going to be on the ground fighting in a clash of foot soldiers and some cavalry and such. Well, the characters died. Not all of them, but most of them. My girlfriend's character lived, and she was the one who had been less enthusiastic about this religion of Bane and its takeover. She had more personal motivations, family-based, and she wasn't as gung-ho about dominating the land with this military religious order. And she was my girlfriend, and her character happened to be the one that survived. And I do believe that everybody else's character died in the battle. Not from a tactical round-by-round combat encounter with the death and dying rules, but just because my mass combat rules said so, and their checks that they rolled weren't spectacular, and I rolled on this table of effects, and they ended up dead. And I said, well, you have fallen in battle. You were slain by demons and undead, and it's over for you. Your characters have perished. And everybody was very put off by that, understandably so. Most of the players got very upset and frustrated with me 2 of them quit the campaign. They didn't want to play anymore. They didn't like the idea that their side had lost, particularly they had lost in this other rule set that I had designed that wasn't entirely clear to them. They didn't fully understand it, and they didn't completely know what was at stake, and their characters had died, well, not off screen. It wasn't off screen because we were there actively talking about it, and that was the main focus of the session, but they felt detached from it, right? They weren't moving their mini around and deciding round by round tactical combat choices with their spells and their magic items and such. It was just dice rules and some storytelling description. And that shattered the campaign. It splintered it, rather. So that, 4th edition terms, this would have been like getting into Paragon tier. So we made an offshoot campaign that still kept my girlfriend's character and 2 of the players that stuck around, and then we got 2 new characters to join or 2 new players rather to join the group, and it went from Bane of Erland to Heroes of Erland, and the Order of Bane was largely fallen, and they had created a new party that was, instead of a lawful evil bent, leaning party, was more of like a neutral good leaning party. And this went all the way to level 30, mind you. This campaign lasted for 3 years, going from level 1 to level 30 in 4th edition, all the way up to fighting Orcus and like elder, great old ones. And anyhow, this was not one of my finest moments. And I'm not happy that I pissed off a couple of the players, people that had invested a lot of time into their characters in the campaign. Now, I have said before that I consider myself a purist DM and that I don't fudge dice rolls and player characters can die. And that's just the risk that you take when you become an adventurer and you get tangled up in plots to fight against monsters and political forces and dread supernatural doom and the dire mysteries of a fantasy world. That's the risk you take. And you can play things safer and more dangerous. And generally speaking, there's a high risk, high reward, low risk, low reward element that runs throughout it all. But despite the fact that I am a DM that embraces harshness and letting the dice fall where they may, and bad decisions, bad tactics, bad luck can turn into permanent player or permanent character death, I'm not happy with how that situation turned out. What I should have done was either develop those mass combat rules better with the player characters, so it would be a group effort that we together have developed these rules and agreed upon the terms, and been clear about the terms and the potential consequences. Or I should have, in the midst of this massive battle, zoomed in to a round-by-round tactical combat scenario with the minis and played out a very high difficulty encounter that would represent the fact that their characters had gotten into a situation that was over their heads. But it's never impossible, right? There's always so many different factors in D&D, and you have your choices and your different spells and just the luck of the dice roll, and sometimes players can defeat overwhelming odds. So both of those solutions would have been better than what actually turned out. So that is something that has not sat well with me to this day. So I'll just go into one other big mistake that I've made, because I have a long list of them that I could really make a lot of videos about. The last thing is going to be a more general thing. I don't have a specific story that I can tell you about it, but it's an important lesson to learn. And it's that for some time I focused too much on my own story as the DM, as the storyteller, world builder. Now, don't get me wrong. The Dungeon Master needs to tell a story that he enjoys, right? You need to get satisfaction and gratification out of the D&D experience. You are arguably the person who does put in the most time and effort and bear the most responsibility for the whole group, for the game, yes. So it needs to be something that's rewarding for you on a personal level. But balance in all things, my friends. You can go too far with that, and I did go too far with that for quite some time. And I focused so much on telling the story that I wanted to tell, with the NPCs that I wanted to be in the world, moving and shaking things, and I wanted things to turn out a certain way. And I would say no to different ideas that the players would give to me because I thought those ideas were threatening the integrity of the campaign, or they were threatening, they were changing, shaking up too much this grand concept that I had of the tone of the campaign and where the story was going. And I shut people down too many times. I said, I naysayed their ideas, or I just said no. I just DM veto hammer on that idea. So now I've learned to ease off. Yes, I do want to tell my story and I want to craft my world and my non-player characters, but also I love to embrace the spirit of the living game. Things can happen that I didn't expect or anticipate, and that's a wonderful thing. I get to be along for the ride as much as the player characters are. Things are going to happen that I didn't expect. I get surprise out of that. I get new ideas out of that. I get a sense of wonder. I'm able to set a stage, and there's factions in the world that are vying for control, and there's certain NPCs that have their opinions and their own powers and ideas. So there is a stage, a dynamic stage of things that are happening, of plots in the world, and there are different props on this stage that you can tinker and toy around with. And then I get to take a step back. Let the characters play with the props on that stage. Let them experiment and interact with those characters. Let them navigate their ship through this odyssey of strange islands, and let's see where it goes. I get to give them freedom and control and agency, and then I respond to that. It's a wonderful back and forth. It's a real dialogue. And that's so much more rewarding for myself and the players to be actively engaged in creating the experience simultaneously. And this also allows them to respect the DM more as well. It allows the characters to say, yes, you are the DM, so you do have the final say in things, and it is your world and your story, and we are trusting in you. But you've built up a sort of confidence with them. It really is a matter of trust. You've earned their trust, and so they're happy to let you be the overall storyteller and final judge in the matters, because you've showed them that they too have agency in this game, and that you want to let them do what they want to do and to say yes to their ideas. Now, of course, this is within reason. A character can't just say, well, in my backstory, I've inherited a ring of 3 wishes, and I've had that since level 1. So you have to say yes because that's my backstory. Well, okay, you have to draw a line somewhere. Things do have to be earned, right? That's I think one of the great things about Dungeons and Dragons is you really have to earn everything, and it's difficult. But that's what makes it all the more rewarding, because you know that you have confronted challenges and truly earned these character levels and magic items and prestige within the world and these amazing plot points within the story. So, finding a sense of balance where you are still the dungeon master. Yeah, you are the master. You're still the storyteller. You're the one who's painting the picture. But at the same time, you get to enjoy sitting back and watching the player characters driving the carriage from time to time and affecting the world and affecting the story. And you get to improvise and modify things and get that wonderful sense of watching a living story unfolding before your eyes, as opposed to just manipulating and controlling and putting everything on a railroad track, and it has to go a certain way. And if someone bumps the rail cart too much one way or the other, you're like, no, stop that. So I hope these mistakes that I have made are valuable for you. I hope listening to me talking about these things has some kind of meaning for you. Also, welcome to my new apartment. I'm really happy to be here, and I finally have a space so I can put up my D&D stuff and my books, and also, hoping to not bump the camera, these are a couple of the maps that I make on my Patreon. I got links down in the description below. We've got my minis. We've got acid pits of Karok for those that have been following the channel for a while. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all for watching this video. If you like this format of video where it's a little more off the cuff and I'm just speaking openly to you, please let me know in a comment. Like, subscribe, send me 1,000 gold pieces so I can invest it into my channel. Anything you want to do it all. I'm glad you're here and I look forward to more videos to come. May your adventures be many!